Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to today's event. I'm David, and I'm part of the Lurgan Townscape Heritage Scheme, which is a regeneration scheme in Lurgan for historic buildings to repair and restore historic buildings in the town, while also promoting the history and heritage of Lurgan. It's a scheme which is supported by the Armagh City, Banbridge and Crevenborough Council and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And this event is being held as part of the Townscape scheme with support from the Department for Communities Historic Environment Division. So this is one of a series of events that we're running, which are sort of looking at vernacular buildings or traditional buildings, looking at the materials that they're constructed from, how to repair and maintain them, and also looking at their history of their production. So a few weeks ago, we had an event in Orchard Island where we were inviting building owners to come and find out about the do's and don'ts of maintenance. And today's event, we're looking at brick. We're having an event in a couple of weeks' time looking at roofs, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. I suppose just to say a little bit about why we're sort of focusing on bricks. So in the council, we have a vernacular cottage in the townland of Temora near Orchard Island. And we'd love to do a whole restoration job on it. It's a cottage which goes back to about the 1840s. A traditional cottage, a bit of mud walling, bit of rubble, thatch under tin, or tin over thatch, whatever way you want to put it. And then there was a 2-story extension added on later, which was made from stone and bricks. So we don't have the money to restore it. So what we're trying to do is just do a series of interventions to stop it deteriorating. And it's sort of an interesting process then. What can we do at minimal cost, which will have long-term effects? And we sort of thought, well, there's bound to be lots of people who have that sort of issue. So we've devised this series of talks themed around providing sort of advice on the do's and don'ts of what to do and what not to do. One of the materials that are used in the cottage is brick. There's a fantastic gable wall at the cottage, and I really should have had a picture of it, but it's got every type of colour, shape, size of brick you could imagine, including what can only be described as like a banana brick, so a sort of shape like a banana. And obviously the Kane family who lived there, they must have just gathered up whatever was available, to build this wall. And when you look at it, you sort of think, there's a lot of history to brick, and it may not immediately come to mind that there's much to say about it. But when you look at a wall like that, you go, there is actually quite a lot to say. And you look at all those different colours, all those different sizes, how they're made, where did the material come from. So it's maybe perhaps, and I know there's a lot of expertise in this room, but I would say it's maybe one of our most neglected vernacular materials in terms of the amount of information out there. Certainly when you compare it to thatch, lime, sash windows, all that sort of stuff, there's a lot. Whereas brick sort of tends to be forgotten about, maybe because it's so ubiquitous and we see it everywhere. But yet it's used in the most humblest of buildings to the grandest of buildings. And we're actually in a building here in Lurgan, a listed building, the Lurgan Masonic Hall. I have to thank Richard Redmond and the Masonic Committee for allowing us to use it. It's a building we haven't been in, so it's great that they've opened it up for us to use it. And Richard will be on hand actually later on when the event finishes around 1 o'clock to bring you up into the meeting rooms upstairs, which is some beautiful carpentry and portraits and things, and he'll be there to answer any questions you may have. So today we're going to shine a light on the humble brick, and I'm delighted to say we've got 2 really great speakers approaching it from maybe different perspectives but complementary perspectives. So we've Stephen Gilmore, an archaeologist, and Susan Roundtree, a conservation architect, who between them I think should cover any questions you've ever had about bricks. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker now, Stephen Gilmore. Stephen Gilmore is an archaeologist of some 30 years experience. He's a director of the Northern Archaeological Consultancy, one of the leading companies in Northern Ireland for archaeological services. We've been working with Stephen actually in the Townscape scheme on a community excavation at the late Iron Age, early medieval site at Kilmacolmug. And I think I've been working there now maybe 2 to 3 years. And I think it was in one of our conversations, Stephen happened to mention that he was interested in bricks and that he was doing an MPhil PhD research on bricks. And I think I filed it to the back of my head going, God, I must get Stephen to do a talk about that someday. So that day has arrived. Stephen, as well as doing research in brickworks, which is really focusing on the Belfast brickworks, he's also excavated or been the site director of two excavation brickworks, one at Annandale Brickworks and Castle Espy Brickworks. And the Northern Archaeological Consultancy as well also excavated brickworks here in Lurgan at Carrickvale, just near the hospital or the old workhouse. So Stephen's going to give us a context of the history of the industry and really set us up, for Susan's talk after. You happy enough, Stephen? Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Good morning, folks. Right, my interesting in brickmaking I'm Stephen Gilmore, by the way, just in case you hadn't worked that one out. My interest in brickmaking technology was kindled during my direction of the 2001 excavation at the Annandale Brickworks site. It was the largest brickworks archaeologically excavated within the British Isles till that time. My interest was further developed with another excavation about 3 or 4 years later at Castle Espy, the WWT site. They were developing it. Basically, it was the excavation, investigation and presentation of the continuous kiln and the brickworks. And again, in 2019, we also excavated a brick clamp at Carrickvale in Lurgan, as David was saying, up behind the workhouse. When Northern Archaeological Consultancy embarked upon the Annandale excavation in 2002, we'd no idea that the knowledge and experience that we would gain would be vital to our work on a second and even more important brickworks at Castle Espy, and I certainly had no idea that it would ignite a spark of interest that would lead me to embark on an MPhil and a PhD on the topic. In the early 2000s, there's the two sites there, Annandale and Castle Espy. NAC were involved in the discovery and excavation of two Hoffman kilns. These are massive massive structures designed for the industrial firing of brick. One was circular and built on the edge of a booming Victorian industrial city at the height of its expansion, while the other was an elongated octagon built 30 years earlier in rural North Down as the industrialisation of Ulster kicked off in earnest. It was this early Hoffman kiln, that's, a 1912 photograph of it. That's the site the bits of the site that we managed to uncover, site plan of it, and a reconstruction of what the Hoffman kiln looked like. As I say, it was this early Hoffman kiln built at Castle Espy near Cumber that illustrated the idea of the Victorian entrepreneur so well. Robert Moorland saw an opportunity in the rapid expansion of Belfast and a means to take advantage of this demand for the vast quantities of industrially produced good quality brick. He adopted the latest technology in the field and constructed a kiln to the most modern specifications. This was an incredible piece of foresight and investment for a mid-1860s rural North Down lime quarry owner. The Annandale Hoffman, that is the Hoffman kiln there. That is the brickworks associated with it. That's Wellington College now, up there. Annandale Grammar School was here. Annandale Hoffman was built 30 years later on the edge of South Belfast in the heart of an area which had been a centre for brickmaking for at least 60 years. It was constructed under the auspices of the Annandale Brick Company Limited, which had developed from the earlier ownership of James and Nicholas Carolan and William Fitzpatrick. This large circular Hoffman was less than 500 metres south of the also circular first Hoffman kiln built in Ireland, and one of the earliest built in the UK. The Annandale kiln too was something of an anachronism, being a very large circular Hoffman kiln built 20 years after rectangular and octagonal Hoffmans had replaced the original circular plan. So basically it shouldn't have been built like that. It should have been rectangular or octagonal. And that part of my research is, why did they do it? The kiln suffered very different fates. The Annandale Hoffman, the largest of its kind in Ireland, was demolished for schools and housing. and the Castle S.V. Hoffman was conserved to be displayed to the public as a very important part of our industrial heritage. But I'm not going to talk about those excavations. Irish brickmaking. The earliest references to brick in Ireland were found in the Murage taxes of medieval towns, which is a tax on goods coming through the curtain wall. Brick was noted as liable for tax in the Murage charters of Kilkenny, 1283, Drogheda of 1296, and Youghal of 1358. It's not known whether the bricks were locally made or imported, but obviously if you're going to tax something, there must be enough of it to make it worth your while taxing. Northern sources, though, are later, and they're both documentary and physical. In 1568, Sir Brian O'Neill and Sir Henry Sidney had made agreements to cause and to cut so much wood for the burning of brick as shall be approved by Sir John Beddoe. This was the first reference to brickmaking in Ulster, but the earliest physical or archaeological evidence for brick was at Carrickfergus Castle, also mid-16th century. The castle and town were refortified and modernised in the 1560s, and brick was used to construct the castle gun ports. At excavations carried out in the mid-20th century at Joymont, there were two types of Tudor brick found by Jope. Bricks in a recess in Strangford Castle may also be late 16th century. There's evidence from Mountjoy Castle dating to 1605. This is Mountjoy Castle. And Mongalvin Castle in Donegal dating to 1619. Castle Caulfield in Tyrone, 1619 again. Newton Stewart Castle in County Tyrone, pre-1620. Kilwater Castle dating to the 1630s. Brick was being used for oven linings and fireplace linings and star-shaped chimney at Newton Stewart Castle. Though this is probably, Mountjoy Castle is probably one of the best evidences of early brick. There was quite a lot of it used as the upper stories above fieldstone base. In 1575, Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, stated, "I resolved not to build but at one place, namely at Belfast." Now, unfortunately, due to his failure in the war against the O'Neills, he fell from grace, and because of his trial for treason and subsequent execution, the plans were never fulfilled. Some of those involved in the construction of the plantation are known. The Drapers' Company had sent over George Burkett, a London bricklayer, in 1614 to build a house at Moneymore. At Derry, Achadoy, and Movanacher, Peter Benson, a tiler and brickmaker, was in charge of both the brickmaking and the masons. In 1611, the plantation commissioners reported, "We came to Belfast where we found many masons, bricklayers and other labourers at work who had taken down the ruins of a decayed castle," which was the old O'Neill Castle, "and likewise laid the foundations of a brick house 50 feet long." And where are we? Oh, sorry about that one. We'll go back again. Pressing the wrong button. That's probably somewhere in here he's talking about. They further noted, near which town the said Arthur Chichester have ready made about 1,200,000 of good bricks, where after furnishing of the said castle, house and bawn, there will be a good proportion left for the building of other tenants within the said town. The decision to use brick to construct a castle in this period in Ireland is relatively uncommon, probably because there was no good building stone in, the middle of the Lagan Valley. But good brick earth was plentiful, as was illustrated with a lot of the brickworks that used the same material for the succeeding 3 or 4 centuries. 35 of these Belfast castle bricks have been recovered in excavations in the area, all under 50mm thickness. That's an early map of the castle, or plan of the castle, and this is a reconstruction of what the centre of Belfast would look like. High Street, you have the Farset running up the middle of High Street, the castle there, which is where British Home Stores more or less would have been. Now, there's another good reason for using brick to build your castle. Newry had burnt down in 1600 and Bangor had burnt down in 1625, and consideration of the dangers of fire in a wooden town caused an act to be passed in Belfast in 1639 ordering brick chimneys and houses. Like before that, a lot of them were built out of wood with a clay coating, which, well, you can work out the ramifications of that for yourself. A similar bylaw was passed in 1667, so obviously Belfast people, like now, were thrown and basically paid no attention. The earlier statute obviously had not been entirely successful, and this was a situation that was common across the British Isles, in which such laws were made and were repeatedly ignored and remade and repeatedly ignored. Now, the earliest brick fields in the Lurgan Valley were located southwest of Belfast along the Blackstaff, basically where the bus depot and train depot is behind the Europa. Basically down about here. That's sort of, what is, and then leading down into what is now Sandy Row. The area was called the Brick Hills, Brick Pits, Brick Lane, and there was a house called Brick House, which is illustrated there. I think there was with the Trent, some archaeological work was carried out in advance of the new development for the new integrated transport hub there. The foundations of that were uncovered. That would have been, I think, IAC, the company was that did it, and I haven't managed to talk to Christina about what they actually found because, well, it could be interesting to people who are into bricks. Anyway, though the earliest brickfield mapped in Belfast isn't actually there, it is on a 1696 map on the Carrickfergus Road north of Peters Hill. North on this map, as you can see, is to the bottom. Road to Carrickfergus there, Peters Hill and the Shangle up there, and Brickfield located. That is approximately where Clifton House is today. Obviously, the early bricks were hand moulded, so you tended to use a more plastic clay. Typically, it would have been about 25% water content. But this estuarine clay, it's a finite resource, and with the expansion and remodelling of Belfast, other sources were required. You can see this is I suppose, a early 17th century German print of brickmaking. You got him hand moulding with his table and the mould and the kiln in the background. Again, a medieval version. I think it's from a Swiss Bible, showing, they're making the bricks. They're leaving them out, making the bricks up here, leaving them out the hack to dry, so they're leather hard or clay hard before they went into the kiln, which appears to be this thing here. And again, there's the digging and cutting of the bricks at the start, so the entire process is illustrated. In Ireland, brick size was guided by legislation passed in 1729, based on practical matters such as, a sensible size and weight for bricklayers so they could easily manipulate it with one hand. In early places, some of the bricks were very, very large. Some of Egyptian bricks basically were the size of a couple of breeze blocks together, so obviously you didn't do a lot with them. And obviously you're manipulating these 18th century bricks with one hand, and you're holding a trowel in the other, and all round proportions. You want regular proportions so you can get to accurate bonding of each brick with the next one. As I say, Pearse's Act of Parliament was the first to attempt quality control of brick, and this act was intended to prevent abuses in the making of brick, to limit and control building decay and failure. Again, people were making bricks out of dodgy material, small bricks, charging people the same for smaller bricks as they would charge for proper sized larger bricks, and they were trying to stop all this abuse. The Act introduced the first standard sizes for bricks, but unfortunately, As with similar acts elsewhere, the contemporary builders basically ignored it and went on their merry way, and the surviving bricks of the period don't conform to the stated dimensions in the main. The Dublin Society had offered premiums for statute bricks in 1755 and 1756, which went unclaimed because nobody was making the bricks to the correct size. Now, unfortunately, very little of Georgian Belfast survives today, though the town was considerably smaller than Dublin. Population of Belfast was about 18,500 people in 3,100 houses in 1792, as compared with Dublin with a population of about 180,000 in 1798. So you're talking 10 times the population. So basically Belfast was a small provincial town. Dublin was a major city, in the 18th century, obviously the capital of the island, the second city of the empire. Now, the next I was talking about development of sources for clay bricks. The next sources developed in the Belfast area were boulder clays and glacial deposits of the Lurgan Valley. This is illustrated by the preponderance of brickworks on the Ormer Road area in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it was only with later technological advances such as milling machines and steamer hydraulic brick presses that the older, more compact Triassic clays, marls and shales, which were found in West Belfast and under the Black Mountain, could be used. Bricks were heavy and bulky, obviously. They're difficult to transport, so the presence of the main road from south across the area was a godsend, and that enabled people to take the bricks from the brickworks the short distance to cart to the centre of the town where they would be used. And this is a photograph of a brick cart going down the Stranmillis Road in about 1905, coming from either the brickworks on the Ormo side of the river or Lagan Bank Brickworks, which was down at the bottom of Stranmillis. There were 7 brickworks in that area at the time. Clay was fired in every county in Ireland, and there were 376 brickworks recorded from the 17th to the early 20th century in the area of Northern Ireland. And this is a map showing those brickworks. You get concentrations around Limavady, a lot along the Bann Valley, obviously the Belfast centre, surprisingly a large amount in Omagh and Arnie. There were literally dozens of brickworks in the first half of the 19th century down near Arnie in Fermanagh. And we have, again, brickmaking in Portadown and Lurgan. Basically, these brickworks tended to be concentrated around major urban areas and along the main water transportation routes. It should also be noted that, as elsewhere in the British Isles, a lot of the Irish brickworks were only in operation for a short period of time. I said there were 376 brickworks, but you have to remember as well, those are the 376 brickworks that survived long enough to get themselves on a map. So there probably were dozens or possibly hundreds more that were never mapped because they were basically used for one job and that was it. Excuse me. The Midland brickworks in Ireland, along with many closer to the major urban centres, mostly exploited local sources of turf as fuel. Often the bogs from which the turf was gleaned could also be used to supply the clay to make the bricks, so you didn't have to bring the raw material too far for firing the bricks. That was similar to the way that seat earths were used as a material for fire bricks as a byproduct of the coal mining industry in the central belt of Scotland, South Wales and in northern England. Now, obviously, if you're firing bricks with turf, you're not getting a particularly high temperature and they're not great quality. But, they knew that at the time and it was a case of we can use local bricks or we can pay a premium for importing more expensive bricks that are fired using coal, and in a lot of cases you use what you needed it for. They weren't being used to hold up, viaducts, aqueducts, whatever. They were a gable end of a house or something like that, or drains. So the ordinary poorly fired bricks did perfectly well. Now, major industrialisation and urbanisation over the course of the 19th century led to a phenomenal increase in the demand for brick. And the old handmade processes couldn't cope. The number of locations of brick fields in the 19th century in Belfast shows a tremendous building industry and activity occurring in the major cities. This would have, a similar map could be produced for Dublin. You can see in the 1820s, small sort of central brickworks on the Sleach. 1890s, they massively expand out along the Lurgan and West Belfast, exploiting the Triassic clays. And in the 1950s, the contraction of the brick industry to a few sites. Laganvale, West Belfast, Limestone Road, and that's Parkgate up at the top of the shingle. In Central Ireland, the building of the Grand Canal and the Royal Canal aided the growth and development of the Irish brickmaking industry in the Midlands. As in England, the building of canals appears to have been extremely important for the brick industry for several reasons. Brickmaking had sort of been exiled from Dublin in the 1770s because it was seen as a health hazard, smoke, fuel, setting fire to your neighbours. So basically they had to exploit new sources of both raw materials and fuel, and they had to get them to the major markets at the time, basically Dublin. So the canals were used to bring in fuel and to export the finished bricks. And fuel was brought in the form of turf or coal, and the finished bricks, which were both heavy and bulky commodities, were taken away. Obviously, transport for heavy and bulky, low-value commodities was an important consideration, and numerous old brickworks have been recorded along the canals and the navigable rivers in the Midlands, the Irish Midlands, and in Ulster. And these works maintain fleets of lighters and barges to transport the finished products to market and to bring in a lot of the fuel source. This is hold on, I keep pressing the wrong button. Anyway, this is at the lock, the second lock on the Lurgan. That, I think, is actually a Newcastle kiln there. In the brickworks I was talking about earlier on the County Down side of the Lurgan. Not Cuttersworth. I think that's just exiting the canal, the lock there, which is now a car park up by Molly. The old boathouse on the Lurgan. And obviously, as with canal construction, the building of the railways had a major effect on the brick industry. It provided both a market during the construction of the rail network, and obviously a method of distributing bricks and transporting your wares quickly and relatively cheaply to more distant markets. By the 1950s, by the 1850s, the developing railways, towns and factories of the Industrial Revolution obviously required vast quantities of brick. You can see the Owes Viaduct in southern England, the largest brick-built viaduct in the British Isles, 11 million bricks, built in the 1840s, and modern rail transport from Stewartby in Bedfordshire, diesel locomotive transporting pallets of brick. Right. As a result, especially in the more industrialised north, large mechanised factories progressively replaced the hundreds of small county brickyards producing brick by hand. The second edition map of 1858 may show the first kiln in Belfast at John Moore's Ravenhill Patent Brick and Tile Works on the Ravenhill Road. Ormo Park in there, Ravenhill Road there, and there's Gilmore's works there. And access to double markets again with the by both rail and canal from the Irish Midlands and Belfast may partially account for the relative decline in Dublin brick manufacture in the 19th century when compared to the more dynamic 18th century, when it seems imports rather than locally produced material was preferred for a lot of the higher quality facing bricks. By the century's end, both in Dublin and the Midlands and in Belfast, a lot of the works had their own rail sidings, again further cutting transport costs. In the 18th and 19th century, Irish bricks, along with those made elsewhere in Europe, had been fired in clamps on the site of the development or supplied from small brick fields, such as those shown in a multiplicity of first edition ordnance survey maps dating to the 1830s and 40s. This resulted in a product of variable quality and durability. The process, again, left only a small mound of brick and firing debris as an archaeological trace, and that would have been quickly covered over by both natural process and human activity, so they are found rarely and only a fortuitous set of circumstances, such as that we found at Carrickvale behind the workhouse. In Sandy Row in Belfast, where the city's earliest brick pits were, the remains have been completely covered by multiple phases of urban development. Increasing technological sophistication was reflected in the fact that more than 100 brick-making machines and kilns were patented between 1820 and 1850, and this allowed the exploitation of deeper and harder clay and shale and a vastly increased output. That's an example of the mechanical crushers, grinders, mixers, and brick-making machines from the period. Friedrich Hoffmann, a Berlin master builder, and his partner Alfred Licht developed a monumental improvement in brick design in the late 1850s. The first Hoffmann kiln was fired in Stettin in December 1859. The basic principle was building the kiln as a series of chambers fired in a continuous sequence, with the residual heat from one being used to transfer to the rest. It was vastly more economic on fuel than the older single firing kilns and allowed continuous production, which revolutionized the brickmaking and lime producing industries. By 1900, there were 5,000 Hoffmann kilns in existence worldwide. One of the earliest descriptions of the Hoffmann process was a talk given by a Professor James Thompson on the 5th of January 1864 to the Chemico-Agricultural Society of Ulster, discussing James Moore, who we saw earlier in his Ravenhill Brickworks, groundbreaking Hoffmann at Hay Park. And that is his groundbreaking Hoffmann at Hay Park. Entrepreneurs in Ulster were quick to see the advantages of this situation and technology, given the insatiable demand for the expansion of brick in the rapidly expanding city. The Hoffmann, the first constructed in Ireland, was probably the inspiration for Robert Moorland of Castlespie fame to construct his Hoffmann. And again, there's the Castlespie kiln was the earliest known circular Hoffmann built in the British Isles, which again is quite a claim to fame among brickophiles. Such few of us that there are. Brickfields, as I was saying earlier, were located around Belfast, and they produced not only millions of common bricks used for general building, also a wide variety of fancy bricks and terracotta panels and ornaments, so, I suppose, typical of the better houses of the period. The works in the west of the city used the Triassic clays and marls, and the brickworks along the Lurgan used the Varve alluvial clays deposited by the Lurgan. You got Annandale brickworks down at the bottom where Annandale School used to be, Prospect on the ridge above, Marquis, Hay Park, and 2 or 3 others in there. And then you had Laganvale on the other side of the Lagan. And this is all covered by a variety of brick terraced housing and semi-detached housing nowadays. Modern redevelopment has removed that. Annandale Grammar School used to sit on it as well, which basically knocked the top off it. And given the method of construction of Annandale on a concrete slab, a lot of that brickwork actually survived to be excavated by us in 2001. The growth of industry led to a massive expansion of Belfast in the later 19th century. It grew from a town of 20,000 people to a city of nearly 400,000 in the century between 1800 and 1900. Most of this population increase was due to an influx from the rural areas and small towns in search of work, and they were employed in the linen mills, rope works, foundries and shipyards. The city expansion led to a massive development in the mainly rural East Bank, with the Parish of not Breda population increasing from 3,000 in 1821 to 200,000 at the end of the 20th century. So basically, you can see, if you remember what the map of Belfast looked like in the 1790s, hold on a wee second again. Basically, the centre of Belfast down in here, and we have Belfast in the 1900. This influx of population was accommodated in a great belt of red brick terraces built round the old town core and expanded north, south, east and west. They were built in vast numbers in the late 19th and early 20th century. The vast majority of working class housing standing in Belfast dates to later than 1880. Middle class housing as well was constructed in large numbers at the same time, usually further out in the countryside. In the last 30 years of the century, the stock of housing quadrupled. Almost 50,000 houses were built between 1880 and 1900, and a figure representing more than half of all the houses built in Belfast between 1861 and 1917. By the turn of the century, there was no shortage of housing, only a shortage of decent houses that the poorest could afford. The poor still inhabited slums in the outskirts of the city's inner core. And there's an example of some of the poorer houses in Belfast, some of them still standing up until the 1960s. The immigrants of the 1860s and 1870s mostly settled close to the mills and factories where they found their employment, because obviously the work started early without a long walk or a long bus journey to reach your mill gate to avoid a fine for being late. And in order to have your workers close at hand, a lot of mill owners actually constructed rows of small kitchen houses. Some of them, however, were so badly built that they were slums. A medical officer in 1873 described the mill houses with walls of single brick only, 4 inches thick, and flat roofs covered with tarred felt as not fit to afford shelter to domesticated animals, much less to our fellow creatures. Now, if these houses were built in the later 19th century, they were probably outside the town boundary, because an Act of 1864 had made the landlords responsible for the cost of rates and repairs for all the houses with a poor law value of less than 8 shillings. This basically meant all the working class homes. So the mill owners and developers found it not cost effective to build poor quality housing. And that idea sort of died in the 1870s and 80s and was replaced with a lot of better quality terraced housing. And as I said earlier, the vast majority of working class terraced housing now standing in Belfast dates to later than 1880. By the standards of the time, Belfast in the late 19th century was relatively well housed. It was crowded, but it didn't have the horrific tenements to be found in Dublin or Glasgow, because as the well-to-do inhabitants of central small town Belfast moved out from the centre, their homes were turned into offices or knocked down to redevelop the centre of Belfast as a Victorian entrepreneurial industrial city. The 18th century houses were nowhere near, and buildings were nowhere near grand enough for a Victorian up and coming industrial city. So that's why very little of the early Belfast town survives. Belfast, that wasn't really the case of Georgian Dublin. You had a very large city at the time with a lot more standing buildings. So a lot more of their early buildings survive than Belfast do. Belfast's main growth came late enough to ensure, as I said earlier, that most of the working class houses were purpose built to a minimum standard. So you avoided the cellar dwellings and back dwellings of places like Manchester and London and the other big northern industrial cities in England. And just an example of a couple of parlour houses built in the 1880s in East Belfast and South Belfast. And that one's on the Woodstock Road, and that one's Farnham Street at the bottom of the Armour Road. That's my mum and uncle and grandmother outside the front of their house. So basically you needed to construct thousands of these homes, as well as the developing railway network and the industry for which the inhabitants of these houses were employed. Bricks were required by the billion, as it took between 7,000 and 15,000 bricks to build a small terrace house. A demand was supplied, as we saw earlier, by the large number of brickworks in and around the town. And these brickworks grew in size and number and complexity as the 19th century continued. There's the slide showing the brickworks increasing in number as the 19th century continued, and the geological sources of that map from which the bricks were derived. Right, basically, to convert dry mud into hard durable brick, green bricks have to be fired for at least several hours, more likely several days or weeks, at a temperature between 950 degrees and 1150 degrees. Firing caused physical and chemical changes in the clay, and finally vitrification, which bonded the minerals in the brick, strengthening it greatly. Terminology used for describing bricks is relatively straightforward. The longest face is called a stretcher. The shortest face is called the header. The face that the brick was usually laid on is the bed, and the vertical edge between header and stretcher is called the arris. The frog was a preformed recess within the brick to reduce the amount of clay used and to lighten the brick, and it also aided consistency in firing and made the brick easier to lay. There were four basic categories of brick. You got solid brick, perforated brick, keyed or frog brick, sometimes called panel brick, and the cellular brick, which is a more modern invention and didn't tend to be used so much in this part of the British Isles. Frog bricks were introduced in the 17th century, but didn't really take off until the industrialisation of brickmaking in the 1850s and onwards, and the same with perforated bricks. And there are two ways of firing brick. You fire them in open fires called clamps, or in permanent structures called kilns. Clamp firing was the oldest method of firing brick, preceding the permanent kiln by thousands of years, and it's still in use across the world. Clamp firing was an intermittent method. That is, you build the clamp of the green bricks and fuel, you fire it, the fire's cooled, and the brick kiln or the brick clamp was dismantled, sorted, and the usable bricks were removed. And this cycle of operations was repeated as required, with the clamp having to be rebuilt again from scratch each time the firing was required. Clamps were generally built in the open air with no permanent kiln structure, and consisted of a carefully constructed stack of green bricks with a layer of burnt brick on the top and the outsides. The bricks were spaced to allow the fire and the gases to circulate, firing the bricks, and they were interspersed with fuel such as straw, wood, coal, charcoal, turf, or partially burnt cinders. Clamp firing allowed very little control over the temperature in the atmosphere during the process, as basically, you set fire to it, you tried to control it as much as you could by increasing wind access to it or preventing wind access from it. But the bottom line was that you got what you got. Clamp firing produced bricks by very quick heating for a short time. Maximum temperatures were really about 900 degrees, and you also got hot and cold spots in the clamp. Temperature variations of several hundred degrees throughout a single firing resulted in the bricks near the outside being poorly fired, the bricks near the fuel being over-fired, and the best bricks usually came from near the centre of the clamp. And because of this wide variation in firing conditions, it was common for upwards of a quarter of the clamp-fired bricks to be unusable. Small to medium-sized clamp could have been up to 5 metres in height and contained around 20 to 30,000 bricks, though large ones up to 500,000 or 1,000,000 bricks were being fired in Holland in the medieval period, and firing London stocks in clamps measuring 80 by 60 feet by 30 bricks high, containing as many as 1.25 million bricks as late as the 1960s. And these massive clamps were set using mechanical aid, so they're using an old technology to fire the bricks, but they were using modern machinery to build the clamps. Now, Carrickvale. In November 2019, during archaeological test trenching for a housing development here behind the old workhouse hospital, archaeological material was found. This consisted of a large spread of crushed bricks, brick dust and charcoal, and was identified as being the remains of a post-medieval brick clamp. There is showing on I think it's the 4th edition map where we found the material. There's the hospital there. And this is what it looked like when we planned it and put sections across it. 2 box sections were excavated through the feature to see if it was a simple brick clamp or it was something slightly more complicated like a scove kiln, which are sort of an intermittent halfway house between kilns and brick clamps. Excavation found a relatively simple stratigraphic sequence. The uppermost layers of the brick clamp consisted of a layer of crushed brick, brick dust and brick rubble, consisting of half and almost intact bricks. These layers were above a layer of charcoal and a clinker deposit. On the surface of this deposit, this charcoal deposit, structural features were exposed. You could see brick shadows. You can see there lines of bricks, which probably would have been the basal layer of bricks in that last firing of that clamp. And beneath the charcoal and clinker, the post-medieval topsoil horizon was uncovered upon which the brick clamp was constructed. The excavation of this uncovered the natural glacial subsoil. We reckon that this feature represented a single-use structure, as the charcoal and clinker deposited was only 25 centimetres in thickness. If the site had been fired multiple times, it was likely there would have been a deeper deposit of charcoal and clinker, and the subsoil would have been burnt to quite a depth, as we found at both Annandale and Castle Espy, that the heat from the kilns had baked the subsoil below them. The height of the structure, we could sort of guess that when it was being fired, you could probably surmise, based on recorded brickworks at Gillen in County Offaly, the brick clamp was recorded as being 25 yards square by 10 feet high. and that's about twice the area of the brick clamp at Carrickvale in Lurgan. Each we got something about 20 samples of intact brick from the site, the excavation, and they're examined for diagnostic features and measured and weighed. In total, 19 whole or partial bricks were sampled, and there was a sample of the fired breeze from the clamp and the crushed brick. The sample bricks were handmade, they were unperforated, and in the main, they were baked rather than burnt. So they hadn't got to the temperature of being vitrified. They were very poorly sorted, with more than a few containing large inclusions. And you can see the large inclusions in some of these bricks here. They are, that's not the sort of thing you want to do, have in your brick clay if you're making decent bricks, because they sort of, form hot spots and cold spots. And as I say, the bricks were poorly fired, which manifested in the fact that, when they were cleaned and left to dry, they just fell apart. Some of them contained flint fragments, as you can see. We initially thought they were in as a temper to, in the same way you put temper in pottery, but it's more like they were just derived from the raw clay from which the bricks were fired. Even though these bricks are poor quality, it should be remembered that they were left with a clamp when it had been dismantled and sorted and the usable bricks removed, so they are likely to have been about the poorest quality of brick, because if anything had been saleable or good quality, they would have taken it and used it. Again, another thing that we noted was that the brick sizes ranged by nearly an inch in all dimensions. There was quite a bit of variety of size of these bricks. It's not the sort of thing you would expect from a relatively small sample. Could be due to several things: poor sorting, differential shrinking, or they could have had different sized bricks in different parts of the kiln. But again, I think it was probably just down to poor quality control. Now, in County Armagh, there were 36 brickyards recorded in County Armagh from the first edition to the 1 to 10,000 IG, so from the 1830s to the mid-20th century. You can see sort of the approximate location of the location of these brickworks or brickyards or brickfields. There are several different terminologies used. There were 16 brickworks and 2 kilns recorded on the first edition map, 13 on the second edition, and 6 brickworks and 1 kiln on the third edition. And just there were large brickworks in Portadown at Edenderry on the River Bann, Devon's brickworks, and at Seago, Collins brickworks. Both of these were illustrated in the third edition. You got the one. Hold on, again, wrong button, sorry about that. You got the one on the Bann there, and you got the one at Seago there. Surprisingly as well, we actually trenched that site about 20 years ago when they were building houses on it. There was absolutely nothing of the brickworks remaining, other than, the brick pits had been used as a rubbish dump and there was some horrible stuff in it. Hopefully nobody lives in those, but no, I'm sure they've taken all the horrible stuff out before they build the houses. There was just one brickworks recorded for the entire county of Armagh on the 4th edition maps. That's at Tannockmore South and Shankill, or South/Shankill Townland in Lurgan, and that was owned by Callahan and Sons. And that's it up there. And again, there's the hospital there, and that's approximately where we found the brick clamp. Now, that brick clamp that we found down there was not recorded on any of the first 2 4th edition maps for the area. In Lurgan, you have brick fields recorded from the second edition to the east of the Union Workhouse. You can see the brick fields down here. And these are not actually recorded in the IHR at the moment, which is a thing I've attempted to change. And it may be possibly that these ones were erroneously recorded as being between William and Charles Street, which there are 2 brick works recorded on the IHR up there, but as far as I can see, there never were brickworks up there. And it's on none of the maps. It should also be noticed that, as I say, that the other brickworks, the brick clamp that we found down here, well, as I say, wasn't located on either any of the early maps or on the IHR. So it is likely that, given the quality of the bricks that we uncovered and the fact that it was fired in a clamp and that it was a single firing clamp, it is likely that those bricks are probably either early 19th century or late 18th century bricks. I incline towards the early 19th century, as they tended to be, I think they're slightly too thick to be 18th century bricks. Brickfields also, as I say, lay to the east of the Union Workhouse in Tannockmore South, and there were brickfields to the northeast in Tannockmore South and Shankill on the 3rd edition map. So you have brickworks and brickfields down in here, and you get brickworks and brickfields up there. And that brickworks up there survived till the 4th edition map. Now, the 3rd edition map basically indicated brickworks to the northeast and the southeast of the Lurgan Hospital site. And that one to the northeast appears to have a rectangular kiln on site. The remains uncovered, again, that we found represented a single-use, single-firing, probably. Now, as well as the brickworks and brick kilns in and around the centre of Lurgan, there were several other sites located to the north, recorded in the 1st edition at Acca Common and Knockgramer Townlands. So you have up here, there's a mention of the term brick and brick, which indicates that there were small brickworks fired up in that area. Now, in 1845, Wilkinson described Armagh bricks as being sourced in 2 places, Armagh and Lurgan. The Armagh bricks were described as clamp-fired and red. They were slightly larger at 9 1/4 by 4 1/4 by 3 inches, and they were coal-fired, while the Lurgan brick measured 9 by 4 1/4 by 2 3/4 inches and weighed 8 pounds, but it was described as inferior. These 2 were clamp-fired using coal. Better quality bricks apparently were brought from Belfast, and the Carrickville bricks that we found were of a slightly different range of sizes than the ones described by Wilkinson, and appeared to be up to a quarter lighter, ranging in weight as they did from 6.1 to 6.7 pounds. In 1845, Belfast bricks measured at 9 by 4 1/2 by 3 inches and weighed 8 pounds. Or, to put that in another way, 1,000 bricks weighed 4.7 tonnes, making them slightly larger and heavier than most of the rest in the north of Ireland. Belfast bricks were sought of as being better quality than those produced in most of the provincial towns. They were clamp burnt using coal, and the higher temperatures achieving using coal would have resulted in a better fired brick. For example, in Downpatrick, Belfast bricks were 70% more expensive than in Belfast. And this is, just to wrap up, showing basically a county, a table showing the number of brickworks by county, by map. So you have a couple of pre-OS maps in Belfast, all the way through to the IG 1 to 10,000 edition. And again, a thing to note is that you have a lot of very small bricks in the early edition maps, or a lot of very small brickworks in the early edition maps, they become larger and fewer in number as time progresses, and eventually the last of the brickmaking in Northern Ireland wrapped up in the, I suppose, 1960s, very early 1970s. There was a bit more went on in Tyrone up until the 1980s, but by the end of the 20th century, it had more or less finished. So, if anybody has any questions, I don't know if they're being held to the end or. If anybody has a.
Does anyone have any questions for Stephen? Let's talk. Okay. Firstly, thank you very much, Stephen. I should just you sort of preempt him there a little bit. Just one thing, Stephen.
Yeah.
Just when you're there, is there a difference between a brickworks and a brick field, or the both? Or
Terminology: brickworks tend to have the industrial material, kilns and brickmaking machinery and stuff like that. Brick fields was tended to be the early terminology, where you basically hand molded your bricks and you fired them in a clamp. Whereas the brickworks tended to have all the industrial gubbins associated with brickmaking.
Okay. Is there any other questions here?
Whenever you have those inferior bricks that you say weren't properly fired, do they have run those through, say, the next time, nearer the centre?
Not usually, no. They may have, what they tended to do was they sold what they could. They may have used, relatively poorly fired bricks as the casings for the clamp later on. But with that, it tended to be sort of it was fairly cheap and fairly easy process. So if you didn't get a lot of good bricks from one firing, you just did it again with a new charge, and either hid the poor quality bricks under stucco or something like that, or put it in internal walls, or flogged it to people who didn't know any better. There was a lot of evidence for that they used to hide a lot of mistakes. And some of the bricks you actually see when you're doing if you're on a site and the building has been dismantled, you have a look at the centre, and sometimes the centre of them is cinder and the outside is okay fired. Or conversely, the outside is relatively well fired, but the inside is under fired, but they used them anyway. It was a case of, in a lot of cases, out of sight, out of mind.
I'm just wondering, Stephen, you see the bricks at Carrickvale, where was the clay coming from?
Probably the local area, probably somewhere else in that field. Because the bottom of that hill was very boggy. I would have said down probably along the river, the stream that was there. They wouldn't have carried it too far. Might have been there, might have been on the other side of the road where the brickworks were on the 3rd edition map, just on the other side of the road opposite the hospital. They might have brought it from there, but I don't see them taking it a vast distance, because again, like everything else, it's extremely heavy and you don't want to move it too far if you don't have to. So there were probably, again, another thing that makes me think it's relatively locally dug and fired is if you're going to dig the clay out and have to transport it quite a distance, why not just fire them in the location where you're going to be digging the clay and making the bricks? Because every time you move it adds the time and costs and inconvenience and stuff like that, especially if you're carting it by hand or putting it in carts and moving it.
And just, I'll ask one more question here, but
yeah, work away.
You mentioned about the railways and things there, and one of the distinctive things about railway architecture is the sort of the yellow-coloured bricks that you would have got to get the Mara and stuff. Is there like pigments or dyes being added to those bricks to get that colour?
Sometimes yes, sometimes it depends on the clay. Pigments and dyes were added to brick, but it depends on, in a lot of cases, it depends on the mineral content of the clay.
What sort of dyes are you using? Is it just normal coloured sort of dye?
I would assume it's basically metal salts, mineral salts like that, and stuff like that.
Unless anyone... Oh, yes, Pascal.
Sorry, pardon my ignorance, but what's the difference between a brick and a tile?
Tiles, you tend to be flatter. They tend to end up on roofs. Bricks tend to be thicker and end up on walls. But Romans called them all tegula. And Roman bricks tended to be relatively thin, and in a lot of cases look more like tiles. It's basically it's process and use rather than a great separation.
How do you get the glaze on the outside of the tiles?
That would have been partially. That would have been a secondary firing. What you would have then have done was dip them, and they would have been fired separately with a mineral glaze. It's similar to the way that you would put a slip on pottery.
Lovely, thank you.
The known brickmaking locations there,
Uh-huh.
what percentage of that would be single use?
The known brickmaking ones probably would have been multiple. That one up that we excavated at Carrickville was single use. The other ones that made it onto the maps would have been multiple use, would have been, I think the brickworks on the 3rd and 4th edition was well known, and it was going up until at least the 1920s. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the name of the company. But those would have had, they had machinery and they had kilns on certainly the 3rd edition. The ones across the road from the hospital are illustrated, so they would have been repeat use, dozens, hundreds, possibly depending how long they were operational, thousands of uses.
Thanks, Steve, for a great talk. How far is it possible to date a brick in a building? Tim?
That's the question. Ish. The older they are, the thinner they tend to be, but there's a large amount of caveats for that.
Might come on to that with you, Susan.
Yeah. That's an architectural thing.
I might talk a bit about that.
I was interested too, you were mentioning there about William Street and Charles Street.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking, I know Jim's here, was that known as Claytown at the point, Jim?
At the clay art, some people think that comes from the large stone, Claytown. But there's also a name there, Bricket. And some people think it was because there was a brick yard there as well. However, there's a wee river there, which I believe is called the Bricket. But yeah, it could have come from Claytown or something. May well have.
Something to look out for. But just one last question, unless there's any more. When will you be finishing your PhD and your MPhil research?
The sooner the better. But I reckon it'll be a year and a half.
Well, thank you very much for sharing what you've called us so
problem.
far. Thank you very much.
If anybody's any questions after, feel free to ask me.
Yeah.
Right, I just...
You can relax now, Stephen.
Righto.
Okay, so we'll move on to our next speaker, which is Susan Roundtree. Susan is a retired conservation architect who has an interest in historic building architecture, historic buildings and materials, in particular brick. She is a Master of Ladders from Trinity College Dublin on clay, in the clay industry, or brickmaking from clay. And she done a talk for us actually. It was our first Zoom talk actually during COVID, and we were sort of experimenting with Zoom to see would it work. And Susan was one of our first speakers, and she gave a great talk. And at that time she was writing a book, and this was about 2018. on brickmaking in Ireland. So I'm happy to say Susan has published that book last year, and if she might say a few words about it. And she'll be telling us a little bit about the maintenance of historic brickwork. Okay, I think that's us ready now. So Susan's going to give us a talk looking at the repair and maintenance of historic brickwork, and as well as a little bit about some of the work she's been involved in. So Susan, are you happy to take over?
Yeah, great. Thank
Great
you
stuff.
very much.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for an absolutely fantastic talk. I just can't believe that anybody else in the world can give, you know, a really great brick talk about the history of brick. Like, nobody does it really, you know, so very excited to hear what you have to say. And you've already advised me of a whole lot of mistakes in my own research, because there seem to be a lot more brick fields in County Armagh than I was aware of before, so that's very interesting. David just asked me to say a little bit about what my own background was. Basically, I studied architecture and worked in the public and private sector in Dublin mostly, and somewhere around 1990 I had a baptism of conservation and never looked back from that really, and have always been fascinated by historic buildings and needed to know more about them in terms of their materials. So that's where the kind of brick research came in from that point on. And when I retired, which is nearly 10 years ago, I thought I'll write up a little bit of my research, and it's taken me 10 years to do that, because actually, you know, research and the internet has changed everything in terms of finding out more information. So I know that what I've done is probably, you know, only a small amount really, and there will be other people who will find out a lot more information. But it's great to have Stephen's depth of knowledge on the history of brickmaking in Ireland. I think it's really great. Just this is the book, which came out in November at last, after a lot of work. And on the left-hand side, just I've been involved a little bit with the Department of Heritage and Conservation in Dublin, just way back in writing advice, guidance on brick as a co-author with Gerard Lynch and the Shaftesbury Associates Architects. So we did a co-authorship on a kind of advice guidance for brickwork. I know there are lots of other ones now with Historic England and Historic Scotland particularly have produced a lot of good information as well. But it's nice to have information, I think, that's relevant to our particular buildings. So that's kind of the main thing I've been involved in. So why does all this history matter at all? Basically because we have an incredible inheritance of brick buildings in Ireland, and I'm talking about Ireland in the 32 county sense of the word, because really, you know, architecture doesn't pay any attention to those silly boundaries that we have. The brick that we have in our buildings dates from, as Stephen has told you, from, you know, the late 16th century and all the way up to the present day. And so you can see here in the slide just a range of images of the different types of buildings that we have. Some of them are, a lot of them are probably Dublin buildings in my examples, but you know, you'll see very familiar styles of buildings, I think. And as well as sort of, you know, what we're used to looking at in the fronts of buildings, you have to remember the buildings are built largely with, you know, brick-faced buildings are built largely with brick in the rest of the building as well. In fact, if you've a Georgian building, only about 10% of the amount of brick is needed to build the facade that you would actually need for the whole building. So, you know, there's masses of brick in these buildings. And other uses of brick, you can see some of them in the slide. There are brick kilns, and there are pigeon houses, and tile floor paving and vaulting particularly, and then a lot of industrial buildings obviously using massive quantities of brick. And then more recent work in vernacular buildings, myself and Chris McCollum have been doing an advisory note as part of the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage advice publication, which is going to come out this year. And we've been looking at a lot of vernacular buildings. So it's kind of interesting to see, and it was interesting to hear Stephen talk about and David talk about, you know, brick in vernacular buildings in this part of the country, because it's not the case in other areas that brick is widely used in vernacular buildings, really, especially where there was stone available, but you're more likely to find mud walls, really, and maybe brick for fireplaces and chimneys. And the only exception to that seems to be in areas that were brick making areas. So, for example, in the Midlands, as you were talking about on the canal areas, you'll find that possibly reject bricks from those clamp kilns were used because they were free or they were given away, and maybe workers in the area were allowed to take away the bricks. So, but in general, we have found brick in vernacular buildings, but generally in those areas, or otherwise just confined to very limited use in chimneys and fireplaces, and occasionally canopies. Another area I've been kind of fascinated by is the use of brick in walled gardens, and I think that's because often after buildings have been demolished or have disappeared, you'll find remnants of old gardens around the place. And there was a tradition in Ireland in the 18th century particularly where even stone-built buildings were lined with brick, and you will see that in walled gardens, and sometimes that's the only way you can get to see the kind of brick linings that were so prevalent, I think, in our architecture in earlier times. There are a few examples here from around this area, I think, that I've been out admiring. But of course, the reason why they were using the brick linings, because brick was expensive, was because, you know, of heat retention, and also things like being able to espalier trees and nail plants to them. And there's a terrific example in the walled garden at Hillsborough, I'm sure you're familiar with. They've been doing really interesting work with espaliering different types of fruit trees on their brick walls. So anyway, it's an area somewhere where you can get to see early brick often quite easily. This is kind of basically an overall map of Ireland saying, you know, pretty much charting all the brick locations or brickmaking locations that I've found. As I said to you, I think Stephen could probably add another bucket load to this. And there's interesting information coming to light now. There's been a couple of research projects done, one in Louth and one in Meath, where they have been started recording field names as part of a kind of local history project, and the instances of brick field or brick yard or brick pond or brick pit turning up in kind of colloquial terms for local local fields has led to a whole lot more information about past industry, not just brickmaking but other things as well. And they've published the Louth volume, and I think there was about another 100 references to brickfields that I had never seen before, and usually they were one-offs, maybe for the building of a particular building or a one-off structure. So that's really interesting. I think so. Probably a lot more to come, Stephen. I think even than your records. So I'll skip quickly past this one because I know there are hundreds more, but these were just ones I had plotted. And on the right-hand side, a picture of Portadown Town Hall, which was built in 1890 by the Collin brothers. And I think we've mentioned that they had their own brickworks at Seago, so I think you could probably make an assumption there that that might be Collin brick in that building. One of the areas for conservation people that is a real problem, I think, is the fact that when you go to repair bricks and you need replacements, you can't get them, or where are you going to get them from? A lot of the sources of salvage brick, I mean, brick can be bought in salvage from various salvage companies, but you tend to get a very kind of mixed bag really when you go down that route. You'll see in that slide on the left hand side there, that was a job I was working on, and I'll show it to you later on. It was in Dublin, and we were looking for salvage brick for a particular job, and we got that from a salvage company, and you can see that there's every type of brick under the sun in it, so most of it actually wasn't useful at all for the project. So getting brick from salvage, unless you have very you know your sources very well, it can be a really tricky thing to do. And you know, there are a couple of companies in the UK that will produce you know, specific brick to size, you know, for a project, but it's expensive, and you would need to be, you know, giving a reasonable order probably for that. That all leads me to say that I'm sure you all know there is only one brickmaking factory in Ireland today. You know, having had this incredible brickmaking history, we now have one factory in King's Court in County Cavan, and they produce, you know, commercially produced brick for, you know, and are doing reasonably well now after a fairly difficult time during the recent recession. But for conservation work and trying to find brick that suits particular sizes for replacements, that's really, really difficult. I've just shown an example here of one contractor in Dublin, the Nolan Group have been doing quite a lot of conservation work on brick, and they started making their own because they tried to order brick from one of the UK companies and couldn't get it. They started making their own. They sort of set up a small kiln, and for particular pieces of decorative brickwork, particularly moulded brick or particularly complicated things, they started making their own on a very small scale, but only for their own projects. So, and they are also importing the clay from the UK, so it's not Irish clay as such, but they are doing it. But it just shows you that there's an opening there, and I think discussion should be taking place, because certainly with people like King's Court, who would be quite amenable probably to, you know, maybe going down this road as we are more looking after and repurposing buildings and thinking about the sustainability end of, I suppose, reusing buildings rather than demolishing them. So it's just something to think about, but just so that you know, anyway, there is only one brickmaking factory. So coming on to talk about repair works, and I suppose the conservation charters really guide, I suppose, the repair works for buildings, whether it's, you know, repairing brickwork or whether it's repairing other things. But I think it's important to just think about the principles that apply here. So you can read them there yourselves, but basically the Borough Charter is probably the one that, as conservation professionals, we would follow, and I suppose these are principles that are contained with that in terms of getting advice, defining the cause of the damage, etc. So I'll just move on to the next one. So then for brick, obviously, particular issues of decay that you might encounter, obviously structural cracking and settlement, building defects from gutters, downpipes, water ingress, parapets and copings, normal weathering and age, gradual decay of joint materials, abnormal weathering, excessive water and freeze-thaw problems. And abnormal weathering is an interesting one now when we face into the climate change and rainfall, excessive rainfall that we seem to be experiencing. Poor quality brick, and some of the quality brick did have manufacturing defects in it, but again leading to excessive absorption of water. Delaminating surfaces, rising damp situations. And I think, David, you sent me a couple of photographs of this building, and you said there might be a couple of things we could look at here. I see the plinth has been actually rendered, so I think probably originally that was a solution to a rising damp issue here, maybe with this particular building. Oh, sorry, yes, I missed out a couple there. Sorry, the damage from sulfates, loss of face, and damage from surface treatments, okay, and obviously from pointing. So in a typical facade survey, the kind of things that you might need to be looking at are obviously the identification of the brick type, key to understanding it, handmade brick or machine-made brick, properties of the brick, dimension, consistency, colour, durability, surface treatments, and pointing. And I suppose you've got particular issues if you come across any biological growth. I suppose it's important to be aware of usually an indication that there is going to be water getting into the structure somewhere. So when it comes to identifying brick, I suppose the main differentiation is between handmade and machine-made brick. The transition from handmade to machine-made brick, kilns, temporary and permanent, improved control over firing. Ireland was slow to start mechanised brickmaking. The market supplies from Britain to the mid-19th century, particularly for facade brick and fire brick, and from Belfast from the mid-19th century. Mix of machine-made and hand-moulded brick in many buildings of this period, and transport obviously was vital, as Stephen has said, and the railways brought opportunities for Irish manufacturers. So in the slide here behind me, on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you've got a house from about 1840 in Mount Pleasant Square in Dublin, with a handmade brick. On the right-hand side, a terrace of houses from the date over, it says 1884, and certainly in Dublin that's a very kind of important date, or around that date seems to be when, certainly in Dublin, machine-made brick was coming in, but generally just for front facades, and we were still using handmade brick in the rest of the building, internally, and sides and backs of buildings. So, it's a kind of a cut-off time. There was certainly machine-made brick earlier than that in Dublin, but generally speaking, that's a sort of a guidance, I suppose, for dating it. So the sources, so just to recap, I suppose, a little bit on what Stephen was saying, the sources of brick hand moulded from certainly the 17th century to the mid-19th century, but also later, certainly handmade brick being made well into the 20th century in parts of Ireland, locally produced in brickfields countrywide and on individual sites. Some importation of brick for facades, mainly Britain or Holland in the early 18th century, and there are import records available, and brick is listed as a commodity for the whole of the 18th century. So I've looked at a lot of those figures to see, was there a lot coming in, and because some people had the opinion, that all our brick was imported, but actually there's very, very little imported, and mostly would have been used for just fronting, so not for regular. Post 1771, then we had our brickmaking ban, which Stephen has mentioned, Dublin in that year and Cork in 1778. And that really led to the expansion of brickfields around Dublin, certainly, and to the Midlands, and that coincided with the canal construction. And they say, I think, that, sometimes the clay for making bricks was discovered while they were digging the canal, certainly along the Grand Canal. They think that might have been the case, but in any event, it turned into a major kind of industry, I suppose, along the canal routes, particularly the Grand Canal. So machine-made brick then, imported from Britain, supplied from Belfast, Moors, as Stephen has mentioned, McLadderies, Annadale, Lavery's, etc. Brick production slower to get started elsewhere, but then in Florence Court, Portmarnock, Kings Court, Courtown, Rathnew, Durrow, Youghal, Dolphin's Barn, Athy, Ballinhassig. So they would have been brick factories as against the handmade brick. You'll see a few examples of these types of brick on the right-hand side. So in terms of identifying brick in buildings and dating it, as Stephen has said, thinner size is helpful. That's all we can say, really. I don't think we can't be more conclusive than that. But when you've looked at a lot of brick, I think you start to get a bit of a handle on it. But certainly there's no doubt about it, thinner brick pre-1660 seems to be the case. And then the statute size and regulation not adhered to, as Stephen has already said. The size, yes, based on practical matters, and that the bonding, I suppose, was the key thing, and so your brick was proportioned, and it really didn't matter what size it was, in a kind of a way. You'll see here sitting a pile of bricks. You'll see some skinny ones there on the top. I'm trying to think, one of those is from Portumna Castle, which is around 1630, I think. The one underneath it is another thin one. It came out of a building in Dublin. And then they're sitting on top of a big, clunky 18th century handmade brick, which came from Arch Hall in Wilkinstown in County Meath. And then they're sitting on regular machine-made bricks. And you can see how well, how even and organised they are. The thing about the legislation, I suppose, is that the size that Edward Lovett Pearce introduced, and I mean, he was an architect, so he knew a thing or two about buildings as well as being a parliamentarian, but he picked a size of 9.5 by 4.5 by 2.25 inches. And it is a very peculiar size because it's not one that you don't really see it in buildings. I think I might have seen a 9.5 inch brick in a few buildings in my time, but whether he was trying to, I don't know, do something in terms of the architecture or the look of the brick, like that a longer, thinner brick actually looked better in a facade or something. We're not really too sure why, but eventually that act had to be repealed anyway because nobody was abiding to it. And of course it only applied to brick that was being made for commercial sale. So if you were making brick on your own estate for your own use, you didn't have to comply with that legislation anyway. So I think that was the case probably there. So just to look at some brick bonds, and I've just got 3 here, although there are hundreds of them, but in historic buildings generally these are the ones that you'll come across. So English bond on the top left there. Is basically a course of stretchers and it's a course of headers, and so every second course is bonded through to the material behind. So it's a very strong bond. First introduced, I think, or first recognised in England in about 1449, I think. So it's been around for a long time, and in fact Mountjoy Fort is built in English bond. So it's a good example, I think, of the pre-1630 date. So on the right-hand side then you have Flemish bond, which I think was first recognised and used in Kew Palace in London in about 1630. I think it's the first time they think it appeared. It's called Flemish bond, but it's thought to have started in Poland, I think. But anyway, it's the one that all Georgian buildings really, certainly in Dublin and I think in a lot of other places, really adopted Flemish bond. So you can see that every second brick is a header, and so it is bonded through to the back fairly strongly if you were an honest contractor and did your job properly. But what happens with a lot of Georgian facades is if you've bought a special imported brick for the front and you only need a half brick, the cheeky contractors were cutting them in half, and so they weren't. So theoretically every second brick is bonded in to the back material, but sometimes they didn't do that, and there's been a few delaminations, I think is how they describe them, of facades in buildings as a result of that. English garden wall then bond below the English bond is where you've got every fourth row of is a row of headers bonded in, so it's not quite as strongly bonded, often used for linings and indeed for garden walls, but also had a bit of a revival in the in the sort of Edwardian period. So a lot of buildings from around 1900, 1910 are built with that particular bond. Nowadays, with contemporary architecture and reuse or a modern use of brick, I suppose people are using all kinds of different kind of bonds, like lapped bonds and everything. But these are the main ones I think that you'll come across. And of course, the importance of bonding is to understand what your structure is about. Really, it's not a decorative finish. It's very much about how the building was built. So when it comes to looking at pointing, brickwork character, I suppose, is something that we use as a terminology, I suppose, in conservation circles. And really, I suppose, these are examples of how you can completely change the character of your brick by getting the pointing wrong. Luckily, these days, people aren't doing this quite as much, but the top slide there, you can see the original brick, handmade brick, and its pointing, and then it has been aggressively cleaned and repointed with a weatherstruck joint in cement mortar, and that's what the bigger picture looks like. So it's not just about the damage you've done to the individual building, but you've also impacted on, particularly in terraces or where you've got groups of buildings, you can really make a huge change. And of course, it's absolutely the wrong thing to do, and we'll talk more about materials in a little while. And below, another example of the same thing. In this case, on the right hand side, a kind of a fairly finely wigged joint, which is a technique that I'll talk about, and then again taken out and a cement mortar replacement. So the reason for why there are different types of pointing techniques and jointing techniques are because you can see here the difference between a handmade brick, where you've got a big, fat, wide joint to deal with, and a machine-made brick where you can make the joints very refined. So in these two examples, which are actually from a walled garden, but it's a good way to show it, I think, you can see that the mortar joint in the one on the right hand side is about, if you measured up the joints, it's probably about 30% of the building facade. So if you repoint that with a big white lime mortar joint, it's going to be a very ugly kind of thing. So what they did was they devised different kind of techniques for dealing with that. This is an example from Mount Pleasant Square in Ranelagh. It's a house from 1812 approximately, and I think it's the only one left in the square that has its original joint. Might be a bit blurry for you, but you can see that it's a lime mortar joint, and it's simply ruled on the horizontal, on the horizontal joints only, not on the vertical joints. And that's a very neat and tidy way of repointing handmade brick, where you don't have too large of joints. And you'd often find that in the backs of buildings and sides of buildings, where possibly there might be a more refined joint used for the facade, but for the rest of it, there's this joint which is very uncostly. Sometimes it's called ruled, sometimes it's called penny struck, but generally the principle is the same. And the line just gives you a sort of a tidy neatness to the joint, I suppose. The next one we're going to look at is bastard tuck pointing, which certainly there are plenty of examples of this in Dublin. Again, handmade brick, but instead of just ruling in the centre of the joint, they sort of strike it top and bottom, and it kind of makes the mortar into a bit of a sandwich, which looks tidier than just the straight flush joint. Again, easily enough to do, but often combined with what we call colouring the joint or colouring the brickwork. So we'll see that again as we go on a bit. This example here is from Merrion Square in Dublin. And then we get to wigging, and there have been whole studies done about wigging and where it came from and why we do it and why it's prevalent in Ireland, particularly Dublin anyway, but all over the country really. It differs slightly from tuck pointing in the way that it's actually done, but not in the final result, if you like. So in order to show you the wigged joint, you can see here on the top centre, the joint is formed up with lime mortar, and then a ribbon is struck out of the middle of it. And then you come along with your coloured mortar, your wig, and colour in. And it's not really meant to go over the whole face of the brick. The wig is supposed to match the colour of the brick and basically make it look like the joint is only the width of the ribbon. And that's an example from Henrietta Street, the one on the top. It was one of the first ones that was kind of wigged in Dublin in a sort of revival of this practice. And now there are quite a few being done. That's an example from Fitzwilliam Square in Dublin, this one on the left-hand side. So you can see the intention is that the coloured mortar wigging is supposed to disguise the width of the joint. Tuck pointing then, which would be another way of achieving really the same thing. Certainly plenty of examples of this in England, but in this case the mortar, the base mortar is coloured, and then you just tuck the ribbon into it afterwards. So it's just a different way of really achieving the same appearance, but it's all about aesthetics, and it's all about making the joint look neater and tidier with a handmade brick. And then when you come to machine made bricks, obviously you're not dealing with the same kind of awkward joints, but you do get a lot of variation in styles of pointing or materials for pointing, and these are a few just that we've observed in Dublin. This particular one is from Cowper Gardens. It's about 1930 in Dublin. A smooth red brick from Portmarnock, and the flush joint has a coarse aggregate which is very dark. It looks quite black really, so it's a very particular appearance. Again, the mortar is coloured. This is another one from the Renel area with the red pointing, and you can see with is this the pointer? Top one, yeah, okay. Okay, you can see here how thin the actual colour is, because you can see the base mortar underneath, but so this red thing is applied very thinly to the surface. But actually you could only do that when you were building the building. So this is one of the things you have to be careful with repairs, because when the building was being built, that base mortar was wet, and so you could put a very thin surface onto it and they would bond together. Whereas if you were actually trying to achieve that in a conservation, you would have to rake out the joint properly and do it differently. But anyway, it's just interesting to note. Here's another example of it here, and again you can see how thin the actual black is on the base mortar. So it's an important one to be aware of for conservation purposes, because you really you can't actually recreate exactly the same thing. It's just one of those to be aware of. So when it comes to repointing, I suppose the repointing principles are basically you need to justify the reason for doing it. So there is a certain amount, I don't know whether it's the case here or not, but certainly in Dublin a lot of people kind of seem to consider it a kind of something that you do to your building, but it's not always necessary to repoint the building, and actually if you don't need to do it, you shouldn't really be doing it. Obviously if you've deteriorated joints or if there are problems with the building, you do need to partial repointing can be possible. Obviously research in terms of the style and approach, and the main thing really with all conservation work, samples are essential really to decide on the the type of joint that you want, and they need to be done in good time as well, not just when the builder has the scaffolding up and is clamouring for a decision. So it's important to do these things in advance, and also to test the skill of your operatives, like that's important too. Raking out and preparation of the joint, crucial to successful pointing. 20 millimetres minimum is recommended, and the joint needs to be squared out. And remember, I suppose, that the health and welfare of the building is the primary objective with pointing. So, why use lime? Well, I'm not going to give the lime lecture really, but it's just important to understand that traditionally constructed buildings behave differently to modern buildings. They're generally built with solid walls and without expansion joints, and so they rely on having flexible joint materials in order to accommodate thermal expansion and contraction. Structurally, the walls behave differently to modern cavity walls, which are rigidly constructed, built with expansion joints. Using lime as a binder in mortars for the repair of historic brick masonry matches the required properties of flexibility. Modern Portland cements are much stronger than original lime binders in mortars used in historic buildings, even in earlier cements. And we know that Portland cement has been around for a long time, because I think recently somebody told me that they had found evidence of Portland cement being used in Ireland in a building of about 1860, which is way before anybody thought there were Portland cements. But the earlier cements were described as cements, but they weren't as strong as the modern cement. So I think, you're always trying to match properties is really what you're trying to do. As I said, matching the properties of the joint as well as trying to replicate the original joint aesthetic, I suppose. In terms of lime guidance, this book, which was produced by the Building Limes Forum of Ireland by Pat McAfee, is really a terrific book for anybody who's interested in lime. It's a kind of question and answer type advisory booklet, and really, really useful. And I know there are lots of other ones. The Building Limes Forum of Ireland is a very good organisation. They do a lot of research, and at the moment they're doing a lot of research on hot lime mortar mixes, which seem to have been much more prevalent in Ireland than we realised before, and are now being used in a lot of conservation projects as well. But you'll see here on the right hand side, there's obviously hydraulic lime, there's lime putty, and all kinds of different types of lime. It's a complicated process and you need expert advice. But now there are many contractors who are very happy to work with lime, which is a big step forward when I started out in conservation work. Getting the mix right, obviously materials influence the appearance as well as the durability, and sand is a really important component of mortars, and obviously sands and aggregates and additives, looking at colours and everything can hugely affect the appearance of the finished joint. So just by way of explanatory, this is a kind of a sample board, I suppose, of all the different kinds of sand you can get. And remember that there's 3 times as much sand usually as lime in any mortar mix. So it really does have a big influence on the character of your mix. When it comes to yellowy brick, and in Dublin, certainly after the 1771 Act, when brickmaking moved out of the city and went down the canals, most of the canal bricks that came to Dublin are yellow in colour, or yellowish, biscuity colour. And so there was a fashion, I suppose, for people to have red fronts. Red facades were popular. In the 18th century, certainly people wanted a red front, and so if you had a yellow brick there, you wanted to make it red, basically. So they used a system called colour washing, and that basically is not a paint and it's not lime based, it's just water and alum and a pigment like Venetian red or something, and you'll see residual, I suppose, washes on buildings. It's a really tricky one in conservation terms, because if you put back the full colour wash, in some instances, I suppose, it might look too much, whereas when it's kind of weathered down a bit, it can look quite good. So anyway, just to show you a couple of examples here, this is again Mount Pleasant Square. On the left hand side of the left hand one, you'll see the brick in the infill building is a yellow biscuit coloured brick. The brick in the other building is exactly the same, but has been colour washed. So you can see that, it's quite successful in actually making your brick front look red. And the same thing on another street in Wellington Road, I think in Dublin, where you've got colour washed. But it's a difficult one to deal with, as I said, in conservation. This is a project in St Stephen's Green, and it's a sort of a hybrid in terms of repointing and colour washing, and its recent work has adopted different approaches in terms of repointing, rattling of joints, and the window arches are wigged for emphasis. So here this building was handmade brick and quite wide joints, and they did this sort of bastard tuck pointing, and then they just coloured the joints afterwards and coloured the brickwork so that the joints don't stand out hugely from the brickwork, and then they just use the wigging technique on the heads of the building. So it's an interesting building. This, you can see that it was once a Dutch billy and you can just see it was once a triangular gable, and it was converted into a more regular flat parapet. Cleaning brick, again, in a terrace situation, you have to consider the impact of cleaning. This is an awful example, which I don't think anybody would do this anymore, really, would they? Probably not. But, when you're cleaning an individual building that's part of a terrace, or doing any work to an individual building that's part of a terrace, you have to, I suppose, be aware of the incremental aesthetic, I suppose, of the overall thing. Cleaning brickwork in general, test is really the thing, really, I think. There are big dangers in aggressive cleaning methods, and I would advise, as a conservation architect, avoid it unless you absolutely have to do it. And sometimes you have to do it because maybe there's staining on brickwork that's actually causing damage to the brick. But in general, avoid unless necessary. There are new cleaning techniques evolving all the time, a lot of them with sort of steam and low pressure water and not chemicals, and so you need to be sort of up to date and expert, or have somebody who's an expert in this area really to tackle it. Sampling, obviously, materials and methods, and using experienced contractors and supervising their work. I mean, it's a bit of a minefield. These are terrible examples of cleaning with sandblasting, and a situation where the joints have been completely washed out on the right hand side. Another question that comes up is about removing renders from buildings, and again, it's another of the test situations. In this particular instance, this is the building on the top left here. They did investigative work to decide whether to take the render off down at the door, and actually, the most exposed area of the building is up at the parapet. So you could take a sample off down there, and a brick might look okay, and then you get your scaffolder and your builder up on site, and then the next thing you find that the whole parapet is completely gone. So in this case, they ended up just rebuilding the parapet because it was really, really bad. So it's very important, if you're doing samples or testing out for taking off paint or renders or anything like that, that you do it in the exposed area. But anyway, this was the job that was done, and I mean, they paid a lot of money to have it done. So maybe it's worthwhile, but you have to be aware of what you might find. And here are two other examples of what you might find when you try and take off a render. This one is from Sandymount in Dublin, and you can see it's there's going to be a lot of work to get that back to looking like a brick facade. And this was one in Belgrave Road and Rathmines. And again, you know, when the render came off, there was rebuilding work to be done. You know, the whole thing was a big mess. So, you know, it can be done, but there's a big cost generally attached to it. Certainly with this type of softer handmade brick, maybe. And removing paint, same kind of scenario, really. You know, you just have to trial and error it, and but it's often, I think, removing paint is often a really good idea, because you know the paint can be stopping the brickwork from breathing. So you know there are reasons why you would want to do it, as well as the aesthetic. But samples to determine paint type, and there may be layers and different types of paint. So you know there's a lot to investigate, I suppose, before you start to tackle this kind of a project. This is one that was done. This is the Dublin City Council building, actually, in Crumlin. But you can see in the very top there what it looked like before, and certainly taking the paint off really was worthwhile. It was worth doing. Well, two quick case studies, really. I won't take too long with them, but just they're interesting, because I suppose the first one here is Kevin Street Library, 1904, public building, similar to any kind of a building that you'd find really here or in Dublin or anywhere else. It's built with Portmarnock brick, sandstone dressings, and with a granite coping and sills. The brick had been sandblasted at some point in its history, removing its fire skin surface and affecting its weathering ability. And this had permanently damaged the brick, and it is something that happens and is difficult to rectify. So in this particular instance, we used a system of brick repair mortars. And again, these are, you need to be kind of careful about this type of work, but they're useful for plastic repairs in situations where the brick face has eroded due to water, frost damage, and this can be a particular issue at parapets, as I'm sure you know. So there are pros and cons to repair mortars. Basically, the preparatory work for repairs can be invasive and can lead to loss of original brick to find a good substrate. So they basically have to go back into the brick in order to get a good key for the repair mortar. Different materials have different preparation standards. Some that we've used, Remer's products and Lithomex experiences, and they would all have kind of slightly different ways of operating them. The strength of the repair mortars can be an issue with softer brick. The durability of repair mortars and weathering concerns, I suppose, you know, how tried and tested are they? It's kind of difficult to know some of those things. Also, colour matching can be tricky, so, you know, the colour of a lot of repair mortars can be too uniform. So in this particular instance, you can see that we used a whole range of different colours. So we had a whole lot of different samples made up, and when they came to actually refacing individual bricks, they used a selection of different colours, and that, I think, ended up giving us a fairly good result. But in order to, before we started the process, we had a look and did quite a bit of sampling. This was one area. There was a sort of a window, it's for cleaning windows. I think they had a kind of a hook there so that you could belt yourself on for cleaning the windows, but that had completely annihilated the brick underneath, because the metal had caused a problem there. And so we did a sample of how a repair mortar could work to fix that, and we were very happy with that repair. We thought that looked pretty good. And then obviously with the mortars, then we tried it with different types of sand, different types of colour, and eventually found you know, a mix and an aesthetic that was satisfactory. So that's the completed parapet work, and most of the damage was up at this level. and that's the completed building, and now back operating as a library again. Scaffolding down and reopened in 2017. The second one is a chimney, and this was a building which was called the Pump House on London Bridge Road in Dublin, and it was a former pumping station, sewage pumping station, and the station was no longer in use. It had been bypassed, and the chimney was there. The chimney was a protected structure, so it needed repair, and you can see the damage up at the top, severely weathered brick, and obviously the top was missing. It had been decapitated at some stage, and we had to do extra work to that. So luckily there were drawings existed, and for the original chimney, and so it was possible to reconstruct the top of it. Now, if you didn't have that evidence, would you do it? Probably not. I think we were lucky that we had the evidence to show exactly what the chimney was like before. So we were able to rebuild the top of the chimney and repoint it. But when it came, it's an octagonal chimney, and when we came to looking for brick for repairs, this is the situation where we ran into trouble. I showed you the pallet of brick before, trying to get salvage brick to rebuild, and particularly brick which would have the suitable angles for the octagonal shape of the chimney, proved to be impossible. So we ended up doing this exercise where we spliced the corner onto another brick, basically glued them together and then built them in. And it kind of worked okay, but it was the first time I think we'd ever actually tried anything like that. But anyway, I think the result was pretty good, really. And that's what the chimney is like now. And the pump house was repurposed into social housing, so it's quite a good news story, really. There's kind of 2 levels inside, or 3 levels in the existing building, and then there were new wings added. But anyway, the chimney is back and doing fairly well. So this is my last slide, really, and you'll see it's a kind of conglomerate of Irish stamped and pressed bricks, machine made from all over the country. It's a good illustration, I think, of our brickmaking history, and I suppose the legacy of brick in our buildings, and also craft and industrial heritage that has not been well recorded to date. Surviving remnants of this industry are very fragile and possibly not well understood, despite being part of a significant and important former industry. And I will finish on that note, and those are some recommended further readings for advisories if anybody wants them, or you can have a look or ask questions.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. That was fantastic, and we've got the historical and we've got the repair side of things there. So just wondering, would anyone have any questions? Yeah. Okay.
Do you see the Ron Furley, the hill of the O'Neills? The big chimney, the big tires that's still there. There seems to be a lot of brick in those. I'm just wondering, when the time team was there, did they do anything on the bricks from there?
No idea. Is it a site you've come across, Susan?
No. But I mean,
No, they didn't.
They didn't, did they?
They didn't. They excavated beyond. That's the Knox Hannington house, which is the latest
Oh,
bit
right, yeah.
of the site. They were excavating behind it, looking for earlier phases of the site. But the bricks at actually Chris McCollum would be able to speak much more authoritatively on it because he's done a report on them. But the bricks in those towers are very soft, and the worst bricks I've ever seen. But they were never designed to be exposed in that manner. They're very poorly fired, very very soft, but they're now operating in a condition that they were never designed to operate in anyway. But I'll defer to Chris for further detail.
Thank you.
You want to follow up, Chris, or I'll let you have a chat. I'll let you have a chat.
See, a lot of the bricks that you can see were never meant to be exposed. So it is a brick structure. Most of the brick, it's a stone structure. The bricks that you see now were part of a bigger complex. And so you find that the bricks around the windows are well fired and are holding, but once you go back into the fabric, the bricks are in terrible condition. Very, very soft.
I'm just wondering about mortar mixes. Is there a way of testing the mortar mix, or is it just something you do by eye and by feel?
No, I think you need to do samples of these things, and but in terms of the mortar mixes, I mean, there's no such thing really as a kind of a standard mix, because you'll find that the aggregates and the sand in every situation is slightly different. If you're talking about historic ones, you can have the mortars analysed, though there are people who will do that and will give you, well, this is the way it was constructed, and then you can work with that really, But a lot of the practitioners, I suppose, now who are working with limes are very good on mixes and would, I mean, you could specify a mix, but the chances are that when you went out on site, you might end up having to refine that a little bit, I think, There's no standard solutions, I'm afraid, to these things, or to any building, in fact, I think, But the chimneys are an interesting question, I think. I don't know, there are a lot of chimneys that survive around the place, and they are often protected structures or, listed, as you would know, because they might be the only surviving element of something, but keeping them maintained and in some sort of structural condition is a difficult area, I think, and also expensive. Like, somebody has to take responsibility for that, I suppose,
It's interesting to see your big stack. Actually, it didn't seem to be ventilated to the bottom. You seem to have the opening in it seemed to be bricked up. Or was it not?
Yeah, it would have originally, yes, it had there's a brick arch at the bottom, I think, yeah. Like, that chimney is not a working chimney, it was just retained within the site as a kind of industrial heritage record, really, and there's a plaque on it. But there is the flue is ventilated at the top, because we had to put a top on it, so it had a lead kind of top with the ventilation in it, so the flue is actually vented, but but it's not in use, if you like, for any reason. I worked on another chimney where it's an antenna up at the top, and so it was kind of a good one, because the people who are the providers, or the service providers, actually pay for the maintenance of the chimney, and they were able to incorporate the antenna into the chimney. So, but I don't think people don't like those in built-up areas, so I think we just got away with that one in an area that wasn't, in too close to other buildings or whatever.
Well, I work in HED, and we have a number of very nice listed chimneys and sheltered chimneys that are in very close proximity to houses. And there is always the kind of this is going to cost me so much money. But we always say, please retain the flue at the bottom, retain the kind of
Retain the ventilation, yeah. You need to keep the flue ventilated. It's the same in domestic buildings, flues need to be ventilated, yeah.
So they couldn't make it into a pizza oven, because especially when you have complex of new flats around it,
With your chimney of the pumping station, you talked about splicing brick together to make the chamfered edge. I'm just wondering, what sort of warranty do you have? The adhesion you splice them together with. Is it a trial and error business?
It was a trial and error business, really. The contractor was prepared to take that design on board. But I suppose the thing is they're built in, so, in a kind of way, the fact that whatever glue you use to put the end on, is it's not under any pressure once the actual brick is built in, because it's mortared and, as part of the general construction. So there's not too much risk, although I know you're right that adhesives are coatings. Nobody had asked me about coatings, but that's another topical issue when it comes to brickwork, whether you should be, using coatings or weatherproofing. It's not really advised.
In Banbridge, there are buildings that have stone, but around the windows, you know, there are bricks. You know, with a lintel at the top and then bricks around the side. You know. Yeah. Are there actually problems with putting bricks and stone together?
Not not really in that kind of situation. Certainly, I mean, there are loads of buildings around the country which are stone buildings which have brick surrounds to openings, and that's a kind of a neat way, I suppose, of forming up an opening in a stone wall. It's much neater than trying to cut stonework. The only area where there can be problems, I think, are with some brick and some limestones, where you get kind of wash, an acidic kind of wash off the limestone that can, can have an effect on the brick. I've seen it in a couple of buildings, but it is a very normal kind of combination. In general, it doesn't seem to cause too much problem. Probably depends on the stone. Did you say that there were, how many different types of stone did you say there are in this area?
Oh, stacks of them are imported, you know.
Yeah.
But the main one
Or
is
local.
And the building I was thinking of in Banbridge is probably basalt as well.
Right, yeah. It's pretty tough stone, isn't it?
Any more questions?
I just wondered what the in the English tucking, what is the little, the white sliver, what is it made of? When they, do you know the slide you showed with the English?
Oh, the tuck pointing, yeah. The white, in tuck pointing, the white is made with a particularly fine-grained mortar, which basically it's usually made with lime putty and white sand, and they just, it's a very, light sort of thing. The trouble with it is, it can come out, yeah. So I think the reason for the wigging really is that it's possibly a better weathering joint if you live in a climate that's like ours, very wet and windy. I think the tuck pointing where the ribbon is kind of integral to the backing joint, I think is a tougher article maybe. And that may be the reason why it became adopted here.
Okay, thank you. I think there's a great opportunity to gather up local lore on brickwork. I know that Henry Glassy did an amazing piece of work down at Arnie, passing to time in Ballymonone, and the kind of that big chapter that he's got on brick and brickmaking. But there's definitely something to be said for maybe the THI widening out its scope to kind of like pull in the fields. I think gathering the information on the field lore would be really good, because there's definitely other sources of bricks in the area.
And I think that Arnie that actually did the recreate a brick kiln or something to do the traditional firing process, which should be, although I said in terms of like firing bricks, because they were saying they had to like spend like overnight, watching the bricks back.
3 nights, I think, for a clamp kiln, wasn't it? They used to cook chickens in them and everything. There's some great stories about. Even longer, yeah. But there are good kind of social stories attached to, there were particular people who watched over the kilns at night, and, they used to cook in them and throw the odd chicken in or whatever, and probably drink, as you said. But it was like a party, I think.
With Dorgan, when he's done the railways, would he have insisted on a uniform source of brick, or would it have been locally sourced bricks?
I don't know. I don't know. I think they would have just been getting the bricks as short as possible distance, really.
In most cases, you got them where you got them. There wasn't so much. You didn't have the massive industrial processes at that time. So it tended to be relatively local brick.
So local brick, Jim. No, well, I'll draw things to a close here, but just thank you, Stephen and Susan, for coming. Really, really appreciate the time and sharing your knowledge with us. And just let you know that we have a couple of more events coming up. So actually tomorrow we're talking about lime. We have a lime class tomorrow up in Glenarm Estate. So the guys at the Rockstone Masonry will be doing a little bit of lime theory and then a lot of practical work using lime. So that's from 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock. So we have a couple of spaces free on that tomorrow, and we'll be running a Saturday class in a month's time as well. And then on the 12th of March, Chris McCollum will be providing a talk looking at vernacular roofing, the sort of the history and maintenance and repair, and that will be an online talk, which we'll be putting the details out there this week. And then on the 16th of March, we'll be holding a Heritage Skills Craft and Open Day at the Bar Museum in Tannockmore Gardens, which we're sort of just firming up the details of that. We hope to have one more event if we can squeeze one in before the end of March, but we'll see about that. And of course, we'll need to do a brick camp event, get a bunch of volunteers to watch over a brick fire. But thank you all very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. And Susan and Stephen, you'll be here, if anyone wants to ask questions. And Susan has copies of her book here as well, so everyone wants to have a wee look at it. And so thank you very much. And